Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, August 31st, 2022, and today we are going to be talking about the red wave in 2022, or practically what's left of it. 6 months ago, we were very confident that the Republican Party had the midterm elections locked down. We'll talk about that a little bit more later into this video. But as we've seen in recent data, ones that have been released from nonpartisan and partisan pollsters, Republican internals and Democratic internals, the Democratic Party is up, at least to an extent at which they had never been up during practically the entirety of the general election season for these midterm elections. For the first time in a very long time, the Democratic Party has been within a very close amount of striking distance between the GOP and them on the national level. According to FiveThirtyEight, the Democratic Party has maintained a lead on the generic ballot for just about 3 weeks now. It was the first lead for the Democrats in 9 consecutive months, which came promptly following the Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade. Now, the Republican Party has been really trying to clench on to what has been a widely expected year in terms of a red wave. The Republican Party has been very confident that the House and Senate were foregone conclusions for the GOP, but that simply is not the case. We talked about how everyone thought that it was locked down, and it became much more apparent that it might have been locked down following the Virginia election results, in which Glenn Youngkin won the governorship over the former Democratic governor, Terry McAuliffe. Now, this victory for the Republicans was quite substantial, largely because this was a state that President Biden had won by 10 points in the last election. Fast forward to Texas's 34th congressional district, an election held just weeks before the Dobbs decision, but following the leak, the Republicans were able to flip a House district. Knowing that altogether, the GOP was extremely confident that the midterms were on track to go their direction. It was a very similar story to what we had seen for Democrats back in 2017 and 2018 when they won the Virginia governorship and then won the special election in the state of Pennsylvania, indicating everything that it was going to be a blue wave year. But then came the Dobbs decision. The decision that completely overturned many decisions in the past, ones that had maintained the precedent set in 1973 in the landmark Supreme Court decision of Roe versus Wade. The majority of the nation was immediately against this overturning of Roe versus Wade. The majority of the nation self-identifies as pro-choice. 62% of Americans, according to Pew Research, believe that abortion should be legal in all or most cases, little changing from before the decision. Now, the reason why that's so significant is because the Supreme Court has never been a court that was able to sway public opinion too heavily, though they did very much so on the issue of gay marriage. And Republicans were partially hoping that with this overturning of Roe versus Wade, if Republicans were to campaign on the point that pro-life and pro-life initiatives are the right ones, as indicated supposedly by the Supreme Court, that would help them electorally. But they have been proven wrong time and time again following the Dobbs decision in every single election since then. Taking a look at the first one that really was able to show us that there was something changing in terms of public sentiment towards the Democrats and Republicans, it was in Nebraska's 1st congressional district. Now, I remember when this election had come down to about a 5-point race that Republicans were saying that this was a fluke. It had to do with low turnout. It had to do with the Democrat being a different type of Democrat than the traditional Squad or Nancy Pelosi that you might see exhibited across the nation. But it wasn't a fluke, because Republicans were saying it's just Nebraska's 1st. Then it came to a point where it was just Kansas's abortion referendum. This was the big one. This was the one that really told us that the nation does not align with the Republican Party on this issue, and neither do many Republican states. Kansas is a state that President Trump won in the last election by 15 points. He won it by larger than that back in 2016. The last Democrat to win the state of Kansas hasn't even been in the 2000s, and it hasn't even really been that competitive regardless of the election year. But despite that, the Democrats succeeded in this initiative, and the Constitution being amended to remove protections for abortion failed. The idea that abortion was an unpopular position, being pro-choice in Kansas, was one that Republicans campaigned on and relied on to show them that this decision from the Supreme Court was going to hand them victories this November or not have an impact, but rather the opposite happened. A margin of 18 points in a primary in which the Republican state legislature moved up the election out of fear that it would actually harm the Republicans to have it in November, not necessarily because they thought that maybe it would benefit Democrats in that front, but rather that it would fail if it was held in November. So they moved up with little time for organizing to the August primary, in which they thought the default option in a Trump plus 15 state was that the majority of the state, at least, was pro-life. In fact, the overwhelming majority of the state was pro-choice. Now that Kansas failed and the Nebraska 1st District happened, people were starting to question, is the red wave happening? And at this point, we came to the conclusion that maybe it was an immediate Dobbs decision effect. Maybe it was something that wouldn't impact voters a month or two down the line, but rather was just something that was really highlighted and prioritized in the state of Kansas, but rather wasn't super significant. But then came Minnesota's 1st congressional district, which also had a special election, in which the Republican won here by a margin of about 4 points. Now, the Republican in 2020 did win by a lesser margin, but that was a scandal-ridden Republican, one who even his wife was involved in many, many scandals as well. In addition to that, I will say that looking at the President Trump margin in both Nebraska's 1st and Minnesota's 1st and Kansas, all of which were double-digit victories for the former president, to narrow down to a point where either you're losing or the Republicans are only up by single digits, tells you that they aren't reverting back to the presidential victory, which means that if we were to apply this to any other race, Democrats would handedly keep control of the House of Representatives. Then the GOP's point on Fox News and other conservative media networks were that this special election in Minnesota, in Nebraska, and in Kansas were ones that were also flukes. It started to become a point, a very consistent one that the GOP tried to ingrain in this idea and understanding about these special elections, but that simply was not the case. Fast forward to the state of New York, a special election in which the Republican Party was extremely confident about. Not the 19th district, but rather the 23rd district. In fact, the predictions here, as they were in Minnesota and Nebraska, were that the solid Republican characterization and safe Republican characterization were fair to use in this result. But as we saw in the final margin in the 23rd congressional district, the Democrat here only lost by a margin of about 6 points. When you take a look at the 23rd district in the presidential level back in 2020, you will see that President Trump won here by about 11 points. In 2016, he won by 15. For this race to narrow up relative to a year significantly better for Democrats, at least in terms of expectations in 2020 versus 2022, there is no reason as to why Democrats should have come this close to victory. And then came the big one. New York's 19th congressional district, in which the Republican Party was expecting to win this race because President Trump had won this congressional district in the past. In 2016, Donald Trump won this district by a margin of 7 points, despite President Biden winning it by 2 points in the last election. But knowing that our national environment has shifted so heavily, or supposedly so heavily, away from the Democratic Party, President Biden being disapproved of by double digits, Democrats narrow with the generic ballot versus 2020 being up by 7 points, what does that mean for the 19th district? Well, it meant that Republicans, at least, were the favorites. And based off of the predictions from Larry Sabato's crystal ball of having it as a lean Republican flip, all of the polling data from Republican to Democratic internals all showing the Republican ahead by a margin of at least 3 points and up to 12 points, 14 points at some, and the fundraising numbers being better for the GOP than the Democratic Party, it was an indicator that the 19th district was going to go to the GOP. Even I predicted that the Republicans were going to win here, even though I was apprehensive after seeing practically everything lead up to this point. And now when that happened, when the Democrat was able to win in the 19th district, it was a huge and significant victory for the Republican Party, but it indicated that this red wave was absolutely receding. Now, I'm not going to predict for the eventual midterm elections, and I do stand by my expectation that Republicans do win control of the House of Representatives. The reason being that it only takes a few seats. And considering the redistricting losses for many Democrats across the country, Ohio, New York, it becomes easier to see how Republicans are able to win in some of these races. In fact, Republicans have been able to expand on their majority in terms of some of states with heavy gerrymanders, meaning that Democrats don't exactly hold the same amount of seats as they held previously. This isn't the same House map as the one that was used in the past. But Democrats being at a 23% chance of victory is significantly higher than where it was in the past. When you take a look at the expectation from back in June, at one point they were at about a 12 to 11% chance of victory. Today, that hovers around 20 to 23. Having nearly a 1 in 5 chance or even 1 in 4 chance at victory within the House of Representatives is a lot better for Democrats than where it was previously. And knowing how the House election is currently composed of, considering that Democrats can only afford to lose 3 seats before they lose the majority, it means the Republican Party is losing big time. And it isn't just the House elections. Unfortunately, we haven't had a Senate special election to give us a better indicator of where statewide races might go, though we did have the Kansas abortion referendum. But in the in the Senate forecast, the Democrats now have a 67% chance at retaining control. Back in June, at the time in which Republicans before the Dobbs decision, they had about a 60% chance at victory. Then it narrowed down, the Republicans started to maintain their lead, but then ultimately, Democrats pulled ahead. And looking at the classic model, looking at the light model, the Democratic Party significantly significantly jumps up in terms of chances. In the House model, you don't really see that much of a change, but you're talking about Democrats going from 23 to the classic model 23, then the light model to hovering around 36. So nothing super significant, but still some results that might be quite interesting. And the generic ballot also speaks for itself. The Biden approval rating speaks for itself. When you take a look at both, you see an increase for Democrats. About July 20th, 2022 or 21st, the Democrats, Joe Biden was down 20 points nationwide. Today, he's down by about 11. And amongst likely or registered voters, that difference here is less than 10%. It's a single-digit difference for the first time in literally months. The generic ballot, as I said, speaks for itself. The Democratic Party claiming a lead for the first time in 9 consecutive months. It's quite substantial and quite fascinating to see that the Democratic Party has been able to rebound despite the midterm elections coming so close to an end. I mean, you can see that had the Republicans just maintained this narrow lead for just a few more months when they had it for 9 consecutive months, the GOP just needed to do and maintain what they had. But the intervention from the Supreme Court turned everything awry for the GOP and made it very difficult for us to see how they have both chambers of Congress following the midterm elections. And it becomes increasingly more difficult to see how they start to win one of them, that being the House of Representatives. The red wave is receding, but not to an extent that I would say the House is gone for the GOP. By no means do I think that that's fair or accurate given our national environment. But what I will say is that the Democratic Party was never the party that I expected to win either chamber following the Glenn Youngkin victory. I truly thought that following this victory, it was on the up and up for the GOP because it wasn't just Virginia that had narrowed up, but also the state of New Jersey, in which Phil Murphy, the Democratic governor, won by a margin of just 3.2%. This race was solid and likely Democrat. Nobody was paying attention to it, and yet it narrowed up to be one of the closest governor elections, in fact, nearly as close as the Virginia race, which was decided by 1.9%, despite there being no national attention on it, meaning that something was shifting in the culture. Voters were moving away from the Democratic Party. But that very clearly is no longer the case, at least in the House elections, and very much not so much on the Senate level as well. I will say, though, I want us to take a look at where my predictions were following the Glenn Youngkin victory. This was my Senate map following Glenn Youngkin's victory in the Virginia governor's race. I had Republicans at 54 to 46. Today, I put them at 50 to 50, with Democrats retaining control. Democrats did not win control in my House map my Senate map for a very long period of time. From September 3rd through April 7th, I had the GOP in a position where they were, not even April, May 19th, I had the GOP clenching the majority from the Democratic Party. But as the months went on, the GOP's lead in many of these states started to collapse, and Democrats started to expand and expand and expand to a point where now they may be even likely to have a pickup, according to FiveThirtyEight. And the governor elections are a very similar story. They are super substantial because they will impact the future of presidential elections and the future of abortion access, and it looks a lot better for the Democrats now than it did following Glenn Youngkin's victory. You can see after Glenn Youngkin's victory, I had the Republican Party at 33 governorships. Today, that number stands at 26. From 33 to 26, this isn't me trying to wish cast or have some type of bias in favor of the Democratic Party, though everyone does have their own inherent biases, and it's something to reflect on and recognize. But what I will say is that my expectations have dropped tremendously for the GOP. From what was 33 narrowing down to 26, Democrats from being at 17 expanding to 24. Something is off in these races. And it's not me trying to inaccurately predict the elections, but rather showing that something has changed. And we can see that in every election post-Dobbs. Quite literally, every single one. The GOP is losing ground. The red wave is turning into just a red puddle. At that, the GOP's advantage in the House elections is starting to dwindle. It has already dwindled in the Senate elections. It has already dwindled in the generic ballot. The favorability rating for President Biden is on the up and up. And it's coming to a point where if this momentum for the Democrats continues through November, it will not become an unrealistic possibility that Democrats win control of the House. In fact, it is no longer unrealistic. I have said consistently since the day that President Biden won the election, 4 days following the election when it was called by the major media newscasters, that the House elections were a foregone conclusion. For quite literally the first time in a very long time, we are now entertaining the possibility that maybe it isn't. This is the narrowest House majority of the 21st century, and yet Republicans can't bring themselves to win 3 more seats. they are on track to win the House. But considering this upward mobility and trajectory for the Democratic Party that we have seen over the past couple of months, I would not bet on it as much as I would have in the past. I will still say and reiterate, as I have said multiple times, I still expect the GOP to win control of the House, but to even fathom the idea or recognize that there is an idea that the Democratic Party might hold on is fascinating, to say the least. But it does become more and more of a reality as the numbers get better for Democrats, as this Dobbs decision is hammered in time and time again by the Democratic Party. All around, very good looks for them, considering that it was very bad for them 6-7 months ago, especially following this victory for the GOP in the state of Virginia. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.